Which brings me to Graniteville Swamp and the BJs. I studied Graniteville Swamp in 1995. I did a bird census, and I knew this place. I have lots of photographs of how beautiful it was. Back then, it was a harbor estuary program priority acquisition site. This is a national program that exists in New York City, one of 31 urban sites around the country that was trying to figure since the early 1990s, how do we have this compatible thing? A first-class, world-class port and an ecosystem that functions. So it was born back in the 1990s. It had a whole series of steps the federal government put in place for what you had to do to line things up with planning documents of how you would save all these important urban ecological habitats. So it was on the list back then, and it's on the list now, but no one ever found the money to buy it. Never found the money. Back then, it performed the important service of groundwater recharge. What's groundwater recharge? That's not a wetland. That's the land that's available to absorb water into the ground on a rainfall, percolates into the ground, and eventually moves laterally to a wetland. We tend to build on those things because we call that buildable land because it's not wet. Although Graniteville Swamp actually is a combination of both. It's both a groundwater recharge area and then a wetland, and then a tidal wetland to boot. So it's freshwater upland recharge to freshwater pools, ephemeral pools, which are temporary wetlands that spring up during the year that support amphibians, mostly amphibians. So you get a lot of tadpoles and things like that in those wetlands, and then the water eventually makes its way out to the tidal parts, to the salt water. So we have that, we still have that. So it did all of these are functions that it performed. Now, some bad things, bad news here. There was limited development around it back then, but now there's extensive new development. There was an extensive understory, a lower canopy of plants, like as tall as me, not just the trees, gone. Why? Deer, paintball. Deer and paintball, and people wanting to utilize, like kids wanting to utilize the swamp, basically didn't understand they were trampling this like really super valuable habitat that had 10 different species of ferns and wildflowers that you cannot believe existed there. The deer ate most of it out. They came in 1994. I was there for the first deer to come back to Staten Island. I reported it to the Staten Island Arts and Sciences Museum. Nobody could believe it. Now they're standing at the bus stops with their Metro card hanging out. There's limited development, now there's extensive new. There was limited invasive species, the vines I talked about. Oh boy, now we've got some vine cover coming in. Trampling leads to vine cover. Disturbance leads to vine. There was abandoned cars, still have those. There were garbage, refuse. Now there's lots of garbage. There's no deer, now there's deer. There was birding and hiking. There's a lot of paintball going on out there. There were no homeless encampments back then. Now there's some guys living out there. Times are rough. Okay, so the place is not the same place it used to be. On one single day, if you're not a birder, you won't get the excitement, but on one single day, 21 species of migrating warblers. That doesn't mean anything to anybody, maybe not, but in birders' terms, this is insane. That's insane. 21 species in May of 1996 in one spot. If birders knew what was going on there, they would not be flocking to Central Park to see the warbler migration. They'd be flocking to Graniteville Swamp. Here's the proposal. Okay, this is going to be quick now. Okay, there's the proposal. There's the BJ's, there's the parking lot. That's what's there now. These are called paper streets. They were, the paper streets meant that if you were going to build here, you had to honor that those were going to be streets, but those,
demapped.
Right, they were demapped, so now you could build something big across all of the streets. The paper streets actually were keeping this development at bay, but the city, in its ultimate wisdom, decided that it was going to demap them because, you know, city planning wants this thing bad, right?
Yes.
Everybody knows that. There's
And
no,
the city council voted 50-1. 50 for this project, 1 against it.
right.
Yeah, it was the one.
Inez Barron.
Inez Barron. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say they wanted it. I think that's a pretty clear vote. Okay, so gonna look like this. All right. Okay, here's the tidal wetland. Here's what I call the recharge area, and here's where the ponds are still.
Yeah, all those pictures are from there.
Yeah, here's South Avenue. Right? That's important demarcation there. Okay, so there's Graniteville Swamp sitting in a complex of 3,000 acres of parkland that didn't exist as parkland prior to 1992. There was a couple of places. But one of the things we accomplished, my boss and all of our staff, in doing this new thing of urban ecology that I was telling you about, was we managed to score all this land. And then when the Fresh Kills landfill closed, that gave us another 2,000 acres of public land. Graniteville's sitting in the middle of this incredible green complex. If I pulled out on Google Earth to a faraway view, you would still see this big green patch. This giant 8-mile long, 1.5 wide rectangle of green with the Caldors and Travis and Mariners Harbor all sandwiched in between. So, okay, saw something new right here, right? Those are some wetlands that the Department of Environmental Conservation protected under a 20-year deal to try to preserve some amount of the former GATX terminal, which was an oil storage terminal here. At one point a few years ago, the 660 acres were completely fallow. A new species of frog was discovered there. Not anymore. There's a giant Amazon-styled warehouse, 2 series of them there, and they are here, and then there's going to be one here. So the deal was, we'll give you like 400 acres to play with, warehouse people, but you're going to give us some 200 and something that that is degraded wetland, but it's still a wetland, and we're going to hang on. There we are. These are different watersheds. So if you recognize these ridge lines, watersheds here this way, watersheds this way towards St. George. Water from Fresh Kills and Richmond, old Richmond town, all sheds to the Arthur Kill this way, and all the water from the northwest corner of Staten Island all sheds to Old Place Creek and the Sawmill Marsh there. Transition is odd here, but this is Linden, New Jersey after the oil spill. That's the oil stain after Sandy left the ExxonMobil refinery in Linden, putting the oil stain on the trees 5 feet up on the trees through this woodlands next to the refinery. Because I respond to oil spills as part of my job, and here's Staten Island, here's Linden, I just want to point something out about the North Shore here that was observed at the refinery. So there are no gauges, there are no tidal gauges in this whole area. So NOAA and U.S. Geological Service didn't really know how high the surge got up in this point. Now, the waters from Raritan Bay are surging up the 13-mile Arthur Kill this way. The waters from Hurricane Sandy are surging around the Kill Van Cove over here. What's going to happen here? Does everyone know the number 14 feet above sea level was the average rise that we all call, right? Well, in order for those oil stains to get up on those trees right there, and according to the terminal safety manager at the now Conoco Bayway facility, in order for that to have all happened, the waters here at Elizabeth and the North Shore of Staten Island had to rise to 18 feet, not 14. If anybody actually had an actual gauge out there, we would know that, but we don't have gauges out there. 2,000 people were doing this for like 7 days. Around the clock, 24 hours a day, squirting hot water at it and driving the oil to large tankers that would suck the oil out of collection points. Category 1, storm paints everything red. Hurricane Sandy did that. Wasn't a Category 1 storm, but it did that because of the circumstances at the time. Wind direction, tide height, It all was a calamity beyond belief, right? It was like perfect to create damage. All it needed was a little rainfall, and it would have been like crazy. Can you imagine a storm like this that had a ½ inch of rain, now having 11 inches of rain, plus what happened?
20 inches down south right now.
Yeah, but imagine a surge from the ocean doing this while rain is falling 10, 11, 12 inches on the land. That did not happen here. Can you imagine those two things together? Category 4. Sea land overland surges from hurricanes, or slush model. We're very clever about acronyms. This is the worst case scenario under category 4, green. Okay, look how far inland. It's just, you know, it's a little bit more. There's your neighborhood over there at Graniteville where you live. It's underwater in a category 4 storm. The water on Sandy stopped at South Avenue, and there's a good reason for that. You had 1.5 miles of wetland between you and the surge. So while even though 18 feet of water popped up at the Exxon Bay refinery right here, people were not dumping out their soggy mattresses in most of the North Shore of Staten Island. While the South Shore was bailing themselves out, this entire huge wetland complex was a buffer between, and this is what used to be here at Oakland Beach. It was the buffer. This is why you don't build below Island Boulevard. This was the buffer. It's gone. People are there. It's not the presence of wetlands that saves people. It's the absence of people. It's that simple, and I think I'm segueing into your talk. So, the city knows this. They've adopted the slosh model. They know. They know. They knew, they know.
So then there's political, these are political ramifications, and the politicians have,
Look,
yeah.
how are you going to stop? Here's the Graniteville Swamp. You have beautiful woodland, contiguous with all this other wetland here. Why, city planning?
No, but the city knew about this years ago because they developed all the evacuation signs, and then all the insurance companies dropped the people. Remember Allstate? They were noted. They were the first insurance company that dropped people. Whoever had Allstate, they dropped the people and told them, oh, if you live here, there, they knew that this was going to be a disaster.
Insurance
And there
companies
was
always
also-
are the
there
first to
was also-
know. Continuing on, saying that I have actually counted the number of individual living units that would be impacted in this area. Why this area only? Because that's the watershed. This is the boundary of the watershed of the Old Place Creek system. It ends somewhere up in here, we can't be sure. I drew the line at the point where the elevation is highest, where there's a crown right here, and the land goes down this way, and the land goes towards this way. So anyway, this is a sub-watershed. This creek handles all the rain that falls in this area. Graniteville is a big part of that. That's 40 acres. That's a part of an entire sub-watershed. This is the science lesson, by the way. That is about 1,200 acres, right? All the rain that drops within that boundary gets to that creek or something like it, you know, eventually. It's called the Old Place Creek, and it's what comes up into the Graniteville Swamp and kind of ends here, but actually it goes underground here. It's under the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Here's the creek. Here it is, Old Place Creek. Sort of disappears here at South Avenue. Not really. It's piped. It's culverted. This is a low-lying neighborhood. They built in a low-lying neighborhood. The BJ's, a low-lying area of forest next to this tidal marsh. All that Spartina grass I was telling you about. Also another grass called Phragmites. That's in here. That's tidal. The tide comes up every day 5 feet. Right there. 1.5 miles inland. That's some of the plant understory at Graniteville that still exists. Some of the plants that are still there. But mostly, you say, well, it's pretty barren under there where you used to not be able to see through there. That's just that's the place. This is actually a wetland half of the year, right? These places fill up with water in the spring, and they provide habitat for amphibians. And then we have that garbage, and we've got the vines, and all of that good stuff, and I'm gonna, okay. Now, in order to understand why you shouldn't build a Graniteville Swamp, amongst many reasons, is in the title of the book by John McPhee, one of the nation's great naturalists, called Basin and Range. What is a basin and range? That's a hill and valley. Hill and valley. Okay. He's talking about it in big geologic pictures. That's a range, and this is a valley. Oh, Old West style. And if you were the unfortunate victim of the 2016 storm in West Virginia, you know all about hills and valleys because you live in extreme hill and valley country. And when you have an extreme rain, that tiny little valley really fills up, and it's cause for possible devastation. But if you live in a modest environment of hills and valley, there's still consequences to your actions when you build things. This is a cross-section across the island. Anybody know what that is? That's a cross-section and a toe hill right there. Here's the Arthur Kill, and here's all those wetlands over there on the North Shore that I was talking about. Flat as a board, right? And here you are all the way over to Oakwood Beach in that area, flat again. In the middle, giant hill. Rain falls down on Staten Island and goes these directions. Hills and valleys, basins and ranges. Here's another cross-section. No matter how you slice it, we are living with on an island. It's got a big hill in the middle, and rainfall comes down those slopes and goes to the sea. If you draw the cross-section in different places, now you start to see the real topography of the island, right? It actually is a bunch of hills and valleys, and water is collecting in these different spots. This is where the water goes, off of those hills. Okay, well, here's 1,200 acres, and it's got hills and valleys, but they're modest, right? But they make a big difference on what you can do. Here is a high point up here off of, right here. That's where the road crosses. That's the highest point in this area, otherwise pretty flat. Look at, here's where the sea can go, or did, and here's the Graniteville Swamp over here, and here's the neighborhood over here, right? So you got a little bit of topography in the park, right? And water gets captured in those ponds in there. All right, so right now it's all low-lying with a modest amount of hill. Okay, there's another cross-section going the other way. See, Sandy filled up that valley in 2012. Here, where the tanks used to be. These tanks weren't there in 2012, they were already gone. That filled up with water. In fact, the whole basin there filled up with water so that it never reached past South Avenue. Pretty cool trick. But what if you build an entire warehouse facility by raising the elevation up 15 to 20 feet in the air? That's what happened. The city allowed this to become a warehouse facility. They poured 15 to 20 feet of earth into that valley. And now, what does that become? That becomes a range. Now water is shedding off the impermeable roofs of over 250 acres of a 1,200 acre watershed. Literally like about 20% of this water absorbing basin has been converted into water shedding hill. Okay? That's terrible. 20%. Well, wait a second. We barely survived Sandy. The water stopped, thank God, at South Avenue. Now we've just taken 20% of our water retaining capacity away. So what if we take another 40 acres? Because BJ's has to be built up in the air. They're elevating it. So now it's another hill. And where does the water go? Now it's a hill. Now it sheds to what's left. Now take that 250 acres plus the 40 acres, that's 290 acres, about 1,200 acre watershed, and now we're rising up where there's a higher percentage of water shedding into lesser amount of water receiving. That's why you don't do this stuff. That's the story of Oakwood Beach. That's the story of Midland Beach. That's the story of people filling in wetlands losing the capacity to retain water, and then building upon them and becoming the opposite of resilient.
You said that they know about this?
How could you not? The city planning approved this.
City planning approved it, and what you're looking on the interactive map on my computer back there is a city planning map. So they know about it.
But do you think they ever got a level of presentation like you're giving now to city council?
I gave the presentation to the developer themselves.
Well, they were, so they were gonna tell the city council about this?
Many people have the presentation. I don't know if it got to the person at city planning, but it's gone all over.
We had Len Garcia Duran at city planning, and that he never saw a project he didn't like. So he's not there, he's not representing us any longer,
So
but he knew.
that's it. That's kind of where the story ends. This is now warehouses. This will become warehouses. This may become a shopping center, and this becomes more vulnerable by the fact that we are now in the wetlands.
Diverting the water.
We're diverting the water, and there's no place for it to go. There's less place for it to go.
And if this happens with BJ's, could we end up like Linton with oil in our letting rooms?
Well, not necessarily
Next
oil.
one?
Not necessarily oil, although the gas station at that low elevation at some point could be flooded. But that's why they are building the land up, because they know they can't build it at the current elevation because they know what I know. They know the same thing I know. So they have to fill it up with earth before they can build it. Now it's going to be a giant platform. When you go into the parking lot, you're going to go up a rise. If you were to go there now, you'd step off the sidewalk and right into the marsh. But when the parking lot's there, you'll be like up the hill. Your car will have to go like up a ramp.
Is
to
there
get-
a logic to this? I mean,
Is there a logic to it?
That's all about money.
Yeah, it's
Well, no. Well, here's the area that's excluded from development. You can do only so much to make that a little bit better at accepting water. I'm hoping to be involved in something like that at some point, if we find money to do it. Right, basically to make that more useful towards accepting floodwaters so that it doesn't get back here. So that's probably one of the few things I can do. They don't own all of this. That's the warehouse people, whatever their name is. This marshland through here, this tidal creek and the marshland around it, we have been, as a collaborative, been buying this land up to try to prevent things like this happening. That's why I said we bought up or transferred to the Parks Department over 1,000 acres. After 1992, when we saw what happened in the nor'easter, this could have been golf courses and condos. All of it. There were so many interested parties in turning these wetlands into something else. By virtue of my agency buying up all these lands, we spared that from happening. So when you ask what's been happening in climate change, think back to what I told you about the Marshall Islands in 1989 and the impact that had on me and all the things I just told you I have been doing ever since. This didn't have to be the good thing we have now. It can be a better thing than it is, but we just have to keep fighting to safeguard it, because there's always somebody in the development community in Staten Island says, oh, come on, environmentalists, don't be stingy. Give us half. Give us half of what you have. Be a fair player, but every generation of developers says, give me half. Give me the half. Come on, don't be stingy. And you know what happens when you have something over and over, multiple generations? You get this little tiny square, and I swear to you, when it's this big, and the last salt marsh is no bigger than my thumb, someone will come and say, come on, be fair, give us half. That's my presentation.
Thank you.